Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely fall Friday. My name is Cassandra Francis. I am the founder and CEO of One Piece Therapy and also one of the psychotherapists at the practice. Today we have Nancy Wambangwa here to present on understanding and coping with loss and grief. Those that are attending the live presentation, thank you for joining us. Please feel free to interact in the chat, whether directed to us specifically or generally just interacting with us. Those watching the recorded version, please feel free to leave any questions, comments in the comment section below and interact. And I'll leave it to you, Nancy.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Again, my name is Nancy Rose Wambangwa. I am an intern psychotherapist with One Piece Therapy. I'm also a registered psychotherapist qualifying, and I will be doing the presentation on or webinar on understanding and coping with loss and grief. And again, feel free to drop any questions in the chat box and we can address them at the end. So starting off with what is grief? So grief is a normal and natural response to loss. It acts as a protective process that promotes survival in the face of emotional trauma. So it is a process of emotional trauma when we are going through grief or loss. We often expect to grieve the death of a family member or friend. However, there are other significant losses that triggers that sense of grief and that process. And that could be the end of a relationship, going through a breakup and experiencing that loss, to move to a new community. So different kinds of transitions, life transitions, a much anticipated opportunity or life goal that is suddenly closed to us. The death of a pet, someone we love can contract a potentially life-threatening illness, which can be difficult to process as well. Birth of a baby, that's an interesting one. After having a child, sometimes having that sense of loss of self occurs in that sense as well. Retirement. So again, those life transitions and just experiencing a new part of life and adapting to the change. Okay. So the experience of grief is unique to everyone. Nobody experiences grief in the same way, shape, or form. And some of the changes that may occur when you are experiencing grief is the way you think and feel. So sometimes your reactions are so changeable and intense, can become even irrational at times. And this can make you feel unsure, uncertain of yourself, and even misunderstood by others. And also, you may also experience some change in bodily functions. So there can be a disruption in hormones that result in specific symptoms such as disturbed sleep, loss of appetite, fatigue, and anxiety. And the way we react with others can also change. So the way we choose to receive support. during this type of time. And though it is actually very helpful to have that good insurance from others that can allow you to find a sense of balance, sometimes it is very unlikely to lean into these supports when grieving. And we'll talk a little bit more about, withdrawal and what that looks like when grieving.
Yes, I did want to say before you moved on, Nancy, how I feel like it is so important to highlight and emphasize that the experience of grief and grieving is unique to everyone. I know sometimes I see clients and they feel, well, they question if they're doing it right, or they question what to do. Um, and it's hard to say, right? I can't give like a rule, or we can't generally just give like a book or a recipe of this is what grief looks like. It
Mhm.
is truly unique. And that's important to honor as you go through the process. It's already experiencing loss, right? Trying to minimize how much critique goes into how you experience loss is also very crucial.
Yes, for sure. Thank you for highlighting that point, Cassandra, because as we go through this is a very general outline of what grief can look like, and um, you know, it is very different for everyone. There might be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. And I did want to add something to this slide as well. I touched on, the change of, thoughts and bodily functions and interactions, but even the feeling, often when people are grieving, they're afraid to confront their grief, for the fear that, if they open that door, they might just, open the door to um, a too many emotions, maybe tears or rage. And it might be difficult. It is difficult to face those kind of emotions. Having that fear of the unknown, and also accepting your new reality and finding a way to navigate that. All right. So, how grief rewires your brain. So this response, so after a loss, there's a response of flight or fight or freeze response, and it increases blood pressure and heart rate and releases specific hormones. It Grief and loss affects the brain and body in many different ways, and this can change memory, behavior, sleep, and bodily functions. And it can also affect the immune system as well as the heart. And it also can go to the symptoms of brain fog as well. And essentially, the brain's goal at this point is to deal with the emotional trauma, and it does go in a survival mode. So, back to that fight or flight reaction.
I'm curious, I'm not sure if you would know, Nancy, but I'm curious because there's various forms of grief and loss.
Yes.
Um, can this be something that someone responds to regardless of the cause of grief or loss, or is this more particular depending on a certain death? Right.
Mhm, mhm. This is more so a more general outlook on grief itself. And I don't necessarily think that it may just be towards like the loss of someone, like particularly death of someone that you know. However, you know, even in a sense of losing a sense of a part of yourself. right? There is still that reaction, and sometimes you will notice, your behavior changing and your sleep patterns changing, and being affected by it um, as well.
Right. Actually, yes, I can see that because I think that's a great point to even normalize that, grief is grief and loss is loss in a way that it can be experienced in a similar way, regardless of what caused it. Right. Again, sometimes people experience grief and loss and they feel like there's maybe some minimizing. Well, I didn't lose someone or something to death. So, something can be done, or maybe I shouldn't feel this way. But again, yeah, grief is grief, loss is loss. So thank you for
Yes.
that point.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
My phone is connected to my laptop.
No problem. But thank you.
All right. So sorry about that. Not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure how to disconnect it from my laptop. So I'll just continue to ignore as fast as I can. All right. So next slide is it just shows, based off of what we were talking about, how the brain reacts in situations such as grief, and even it can be your brain can be affected in a similar way. So it shows in this diagram that the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking center of the brain, it is underactive. So, this can explain or ties into, the lack of wanting to engage, and more so wanting to withdraw, and maybe even not wanting to face all of those emotions as well. The anterior cingulate cortex is the emotional regulation center of the brain, and it is also underactive. So, not being able again to connect with those emotions, and we'll go into the stages of grief, and we'll see that. Having that sense of numbness and shock, and not really feeling, can be a part of the grieving process. And thirdly, the amygdala is the fear center of the brain, and it is overactive during a process of grief. And that also ties into, the fear of, again, the unknown of change, the new reality, and navigating through that. So a lot of the time when we think about grief, and going through that, we think more so about the emotional aspect and how emotional it can be, and even the thought processes that can change. But it also affects us physically. There are different health concerns that can come up and that have been tied to grief. So, heart problems is one, lowered immunity, body aches and pains, digestive issues, unhealthy coping mechanisms, sleep problems, and fatigue. So, with these, a lot of the time when you have high stress levels, and your body is physiologically working towards that stress that's happening in the body, and it leaves room for these things to happen. And when we talk about even somatic therapy, um, somatic views on emotions and things that you're feeling and how it shows up in the body. You might be carrying on a lot of stress, and all of a sudden you start to feel a backache, or your stomach is hurting more often. And this can come up out of the blue, or maybe even in moments of time when you are stressed. You can even tune into that and pay attention to, how is your body reacting right now? And just listening to that aspect as well.
Yes, I completely agree. It's so important to listen to our body and the cues of our body, um, because it can also change as we go through the process of grief, right?
Mhm.
So maybe you're feeling aches sometimes, and the other times maybe there's sleeping problems or fatigue. It's so important to monitor it, and even become aware that it can be about the grief and processing it versus a medical condition, right? Of course, still good to check if there's any concern there, but as we are more aware of our body and its cues and in how it communicates with us, it does help to, again, just allow ourselves to go through a very natural process. So thank you for making that point. And I also did want to say this list is not exhaustive. Just in case, I did want to add that.
Okay. I just wanted also to add in a few points, and in terms of how these things can be affecting you, heart problems, lowered immunity, body aches and pains. That's very much as I was explaining with the stress. But with digestive issues, with intense stress, sometimes we can seek comfort in food during stressful periods. So that can lead us to making unhealthy choices, which can then result to also digestive issues during that time. And for unhealthy coping mechanisms, again, it can be a choice or a vice like food or alcohol, or smoking, different things that um, don't necessarily have a long lasting effect to healing your pain, and healing the hurt. So with those choices as well, it can also affect your health when not being aware and intentional in those moments of time. And with sleep, when sorry, not having the proper amount of sleep, that can affect you as well, because that's when the body is resting. That's when the body is going through that moment of restoration, and it needs that. So during the day, you may be more exhausted, more anxious. The sadness may be more to an extreme. So these are also other ways that the physical aspect can show up, or the physical effects can show up when going through grief. So the next slide is more so about the social impacts of grief, and it includes withdrawal. It can look like withdrawal, isolation, conflict due to people having different grieving styles, unrealistic expectations of others. So sometimes withdrawal is used in order to cope with the grief, or to avoid negative judgment. There is also disassociation that can happen, and it's normal in early grief. And this is when it feels like you're not in the present moment. You're feeling more so like you're watching your life from afar. It's a sense of almost disbelief and that shock factor. Um, and feeling disconnected from your life in times of these major traumatic events.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, no, it's okay. You can continue.
Feel free to jump
Okay.
in. Yeah.
So I did want to add, just based on this list, how it's interesting that, in a time of grief and loss, we can even withdraw and isolate, which is another loss in itself, right? Because now we're losing that connection in a different way.
Mhm.
And just how people cope with emotions when it can become overwhelming, right? When we experience sadness, typically the emotional need there is connection, right? So
Mm.
also just highlighting how we cope can exacerbate how we already feel, right? And again, especially when we're experiencing loss, connection is almost like the remedy here.
Yes, for sure. And, that jumps into my next point about, how it's so vital not to isolate when you are going through grief. And it's helpful to lean into your social supports to whatever degree that you're able to. And it's okay to go take doses back and forth, slowly venturing back into the world in doses, whenever you're feeling ready, although everything will feel different. Um, Definitely. So thank you for highlighting that as well, Cassandra. All right. Okay, so I just wanted also to go over the stages of grief and loss. So the first stage here is shock. So shock is an automatic coping mechanism of the body to comprehend grief and the initial disbelief regarding the loss of a friend or loved one. And feelings of shock can be heightened, especially if the loss was unexpected. And yes, so that is definitely a space where you can feel at a standstill, right? Just I think it really does go right into the denial aspect of things, right? And not believing that it happened. But I believe that shock is more so, that numbness, and that numbness that comes, and then the denial comes in, and it's more so avoidance of accepting it, and maybe forgetting that it happened, and kind of coming up with ways to reason through that shock. And it can look like confusion, and it can look like shutting down, and being in denial can look like saying I'm fine or it's fine. We often find ourselves in denial to try and avoid coming to terms with our loss. Denial can manifest in many ways. It could be denial that a loved one has passed away, or denial of your own feelings towards your loss. The next stage would be anger. And after bottling up feelings to avoid meeting the inevitable, this can result in an outpouring of anger, and It can be targeted towards the situation or yourself, as you're not able to change the present. It can also result in an outpouring of anger towards people around you. And anger can look like, being a pessimist. It can be irritable. It can look like irritability. It can look like being aggressive, passive aggressive, getting into arguments or physical fights, increased alcohol or drug use. And it can feel like frustration, impatience, resentment, embarrassment, rage, and feeling out of control. The next stage would be bargaining, or another stage that we'll look at is bargaining. So trying to reason with yourself that by doing something differently, it could bring a loved one back. We often think irrationally during this stage, and the word if is used frequently as our thoughts turn to things we could have done. So, in this aspect, of course, being in such with so many emotions and, missing a loved one and wanting them to be there, it's hard. As we looked at the diagram with the brain and the different parts of the brain, and we saw how the parts of the brain that would usually help you process these kinds of thoughts were lower in activity. um, and bargaining can look like ruminating on the future or the past, overthinking and worrying, comparing, yourself to others, predicting the future and assuming the worst, thinking, I should have, or if only, and even judgment towards yourself and others. And it can feel like guilt. It can feel like shame, blame, fear, anxiety, insecurity as well. Another stage would be depression. So you may find yourself going through just one or all of the above, but finally you approach the realization of the situation, and allow yourself time to grieve your loss. So this is where things start to settle in a little bit more, and dealing with it can be difficult. And with that to say, um, with these stages, they may not look identical to how they're numbered here. So, feeling one thing after the other, it can go from shock to denial to depression, back to anger, some of them coexisting, all at once as well. So there is no direct route to it, and it looks different for everyone. So I just thought I would put that there, before moving forward.
Yes, thank you so much for saying that. I was going to bring that up of it being a common question where clients feel, you have to, or am I going to go through 1 through 7, right? And
Mhm.
exactly how it's written. But because grief is a unique process for everyone, you can go from 1 to 3, right?
Yeah.
Or 1 to 4, or 3 to 2, right? So it does look different, and it can be different going throughout the process, especially again with complex grief, for example. I know we mentioned to keep things a bit more simplified in understanding, where we're not going to tap into the various types of grief, but with complex grief, it can be even more, up and down, and within a day, even because there's so much things that are being lost, and feelings of overwhelm. So lots of process there, even with anticipated grief, right? And that is more so before a loss occurs. Someone might feel that a loss is about to occur, or they know a loss is about to occur. So there's even similar processing with these stages there. Again, it's not linear, the process is unique. So giving yourself compassion is so crucial, and giving yourself space to be, as fluid as you need to be, is so important. Thank you for saying that, Nancy.
Yes, yes. Thank you for adding that. And before I do go on too, I just wanted to add to that, it's also good to know that, these are the stages, or it's very general. And it also provides you with further sense of self-awareness, right? So when you are feeling extra angry, when you are starting to tell yourself these thoughts that sound like bargaining, I should have, I could have, then you know that, okay, well, this is normal. I'm going through it. It's not easy, and I'm giving myself grace to grieve. I'm giving myself grace to feel these emotions, but at the same time also being self-aware of what's happening to you. All right. So I had left off at depression, and I wanted to mention, what it can look like. Sleep and appetite changes, reduced energy, reduced social interest, reduced motivation, crying, and it can feel like sadness. It can feel like despair, helplessness, hopelessness, disappointment, overwhelmed. And the next one is testing. So during this stage, you may continue to feel signs of depression and hopelessness, but there will be signs of light during the testing stage where you attempt to find ways to deal with the situation. So you might be good some days, and some days you just might not. And again, back to that self-awareness factor of just knowing that, you're going through it and allowing yourself to go through it. And by it, I mean, processing the grief, processing the emotions that come with it as well. And stage 7 is acceptance. So it may feel a long way from where you are, but you will get there in the end. Pain may still exist, but it will no longer feel insufferable, and you will make plans for the future and enjoy life again. I read something that said, there is life after grief. And while you're going through it, it can be difficult to acknowledge that, things will be okay, right? Without them ever being the same again. It's a new reality, back to what I was saying earlier. But acceptance can look like, just being more mindful about your behaviors, right? Instead of being in that brain fog, you're more so mindful and you're attentive, engaging with reality as it is, again, with the brain fog, being in the shock, being in the depression and the denial, but actually coming to a space where, I'm coming to terms with this. This is the new reality. It's settling in. Um, and and also being able to be vulnerable and tolerate emotions. Um, Being able to be more assertive and non-defensive with honest communication. And I think that's a big sign. That's a big step, because at that point, you're even being honest with yourself, right? When you're able to communicate to others that, how are you? I'm not doing so great, but, I'm taking it one day at a time. Um, it's also you telling yourself, and being honest, rather than, I'm fine. And deep down, that it's tearing you up. So, um, and even being able to have better coping skills and being able to adapt to the changes, and responding skillfully. So understanding that you do have some of the tools to take you through this, but having the strength to reach for those tools and allowing you to restore yourself again. And, it can feel a little bit better to be in the acceptance stage, feeling good enough, feeling courageous, validation of yourself, self compassion, some wisdom as well.
I just wanted to add how, as I'm listening to you, Nancy, I'm just thinking kind of outside of myself in terms of someone like our viewers, our audience watching this presentation, maybe feeling like, okay, you're coming in here trying to sign up to get some tools on how to grieve, right? Of course, the presentation is not done, so there's more about coping, but as much as there can be intent, okay, like you want to make certain things clear, right? and
Mhm.
and less messy, for example. And grief can very well be messy, right? There again, there's no right way to do it, and therefore it can look so different and be hard to manage sometimes, some days.
Mhm.
I would say at the end of it, what I'm hearing, it's a lot about having grace for yourself, having compassion within that self awareness, right? So
Mhm.
however it looks, as if those things are present, then it can make it a bit better.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that because I'm just like, yeah, this is a lot. This is a lot.
Yes. Yes, for sure. And you know, essentially, like you want to process the grief. If you have to go through these stages, allow yourself to go through them, right? But, keeping in mind that, you know, you would like to be in a space as well where you're feeling more so um, that self-compassion towards yourself, right? Considering yourself, and it does take courage and that self-validation. And it's as I'm saying these words, they are very I want to say they're strong words. And, it's okay if you're not feeling strong right now, if you're going through that. But again, it takes time and it's a process, and there is no time limit to that. And that leads me to the next slide about time. All right. So how long do the stages of grief last? There is no timeline for how long grief lasts or how you should feel after a particular time. So even if you are feeling, these emotions and, you're thinking, wow, like I haven't reached that point of acceptance yet, it's okay, right? There's no rush. It's your journey. Um, and even after a year, it may still feel as everything happened yesterday, or it may even feel like it happened a lifetime ago. Um, you know, these are some of the feelings you might have when you're coping with grief, and it can be long term. So when you lose someone close to you, the grief never fully goes away, but you do learn to cope with it over time. And I think that's an important point there, because when we say acceptance, it can sound like, okay, well, then you finally get over it, right? And it's not about getting over it. That's something that, losing someone that's so close to you, it's something you may never get over. But I think it's important to know that, you know, you are also deserving to cope through it, you know, to work through it, and to get to a space where you're comfortable, you know, in a space where you are comfortable. Um,
I did just want to jump in
yeah,
and say how that point, I feel, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's more of a point about death, right? And how challenging it can be to move on once someone cannot come back, right?
mhm,
With different types of grief and different types of loss, maybe some can go away,
yeah,
right? Moving schools, moving jobs,
right,
um, losing something that wasn't the best for you anyways, and therefore you feel lighter, and there's that, that moving on in a more lighter way. So I do just want to tie that in too, that it can go away depending on what the grief and the loss is about.
yes. Thank you for adding that, because, you know, you're right. In response to traumatic events, you know, the brain over time creates a connection between nerves and strengthens or weakens existing connections. And depending on the duration and the degree of the emotional response, you know, that's what determines, you know, that connection in the brain. So as you mentioned, with something like losing a loved one, you know, the degree of that emotional response of that traumatic event um, may be may be so traumatic to the brain that it's longer lasting. Where something, you know, maybe such as a move, or, you know, the exposure to the trauma may not be as long, right? You know, and the processing time may vary, but again, it varies amongst different people. So thank you for adding that, Cassandra.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
so the next point I have here is about neuroplasticity. It's the ability to alter neural connections and allow the brain to compensate for injury, illness, loss, and other life-altering traumatic events by forming new neural connections based on these experiences. So, this is the way the brain helps itself to adapt to new situations and environments. So, that brings me to the point that, you know, we're naturally resilient human beings. And resilience is that ability to bounce back from hardship and difficult situations, and, you know, being able to make the necessary adaptations to recover from adversity, loss, and trauma. And yes, back to my point earlier of saying, you know, there is life after grief and loss.
And I did want to just quickly add as well, as although we're saying, there's no timeline for how long grief can last.
Yeah.
Also, with that self awareness as you are grieving, if you feel like maybe it is lasting a bit too long, or maybe it is a bit too much for you, truly psychotherapy is an option, right?
Mhm.
Nancy can support you. I can support you in terms of how you are processing your grief. So, just that expectation, but also the reality of it too, that maybe something is more going on, or you just need general support as you are processing your experience.
Mhm. Thank you for bringing that up as well, Cassandra, because in general, you know, when grieving, people may need the permission and encouragement to grieve, or even to stop grieving as well. So I definitely think that, the encouragement and to seek support and the encouragement to work through it if it's something that has been difficult to face or to unpack. So I was talking about resilience earlier. And again, just having effectively coping with stress can build resilience. And it can help you deal with getting back on track and handling stress. And 5 pillars of resilience are self-awareness, mindfulness, self care, positive relationships, and purpose. So these are some of the aspects that can be taken into consideration when, you know, working through the grief, and um, just doing that self-awareness, that self-reflection. It's so important to understand what you're feeling and why you're feeling those emotions, whether it be towards yourself, whether it's self-blame, or if there's regret, if there's resentment. Really exploring those aspects, and being mindful about that. And even self-care, we talked about how difficult it can be to going through that depression stage. So not feeling the need to do certain things for yourself, or not having that strength at the time, but keeping in mind that self-care is a factor, when it comes to that resilience. Um, and positive relationships, we talked about social supports and how important it can be to lean into that, and even purpose, finding meaning in things, in life, in the situations that you encounter. So healing the brain after loss. So grieving is not forgetting. Healthy grieving results in an ability to remember the importance of our loss, but with a newfound sense of peace rather than searing pain. So again, I the word acceptance sometimes for me gives like a misconception of getting to that end point, getting to the point of accepting, right? But it's not about, okay, I've accepted it and I've forgotten it, right? It's more so bringing meaning, and yes, bringing meaning to that loss, and also finding that peace, rather than feeling all of the other emotions which may still appear, but still trying your best to maintain a sense of peace. And some of the things that you can do is, again, accepting the finality of the loss. You can acknowledge and express the full range of feelings we experience as a result of loss. So again, that self-awareness to adjust to a life in which the lost person, object, or experience is absent, to say goodbye, to ritualize or our movement to a new peace with the loss. And also, again, back to having that support system. All right, so on to the next slide, how to cope with grief and loss. So here are some coping methods that have been found useful in the journey of healthy grieving. So you can be kind and gentle with yourself. Take the time that is needed rather than giving yourself a timeline for when you should be over it. We talked about that. Um, Also, you can talk regularly about your grief and your memories with someone that you trust. So whether that be maybe family and friends that are also grieving with you. And as we had mentioned earlier, perhaps going to therapy and talking through it as well. Another coping mechanism would be to plan and allow yourself to enjoy good times without guilt. And the goal here is balance. So, another coping mechanism is to expect and accept some reduction in your usual efficiency and consistency. So, with this, it's very much giving yourself grace, not being too hard on yourself and knowing that it may be difficult, and that you will be experiencing those other stages of grief while trying to get through it. Accepting help and support when offered. We talked about withdrawal, and this can be an aspect that can take some time, or a wall that can be brought down. Another one is to taking on new responsibilities or making major life decisions for a time. So it's okay to take a break. Sometimes life can get hectic, life can get busy, and in a sense of grief and loss, it can be very emotional. It can be very heavy. So I think taking a break is an aspect to consider all around, um, especially when you are so overwhelmed.
That's sorry, Nancy. That's a good point. I was reading that and I was just thinking, like just being self-reflective, truly, as I'm listening, and I'm like, do I take on things, in a moment of emotional distress? I'm sure at some points I have just, sometimes when you're just so overwhelmed, it's like, okay, here's another overwhelming thing to do. And just adding to the theme, adding to the pot where it is quite crucial to, isolate these emotional experiences. Um, and just, making sure you are allowing yourself that space to grieve, right? And not going through an additional transition.
Mhm.
Does someone have a question? No? Okay. Um, Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thanks for that. And by jumping into things, that can even be a distraction, right? And sometimes we have like that delayed grief where you're not grieving right away. So maybe you've taken on new commitments and you haven't even given yourself a chance to stop and grieve, right? You're just doing one thing and then the other, and you're so busy, so occupied that you haven't really dealt with those deep emotions that are there. And lastly, I have here self-care. Being particularly attentive to maintaining healthy eating and sleeping patterns, perhaps exercising moderately and regularly, keeping a journal, and even reading. And that can be helpful, and also therapy. So I just wanted to point out a few of these things, such as journaling. Research suggests that disclosing deep emotions through writing can boost immune function as well as mood and well-being. Um, Conversely, the stress of holding in strong feelings can ratchet up blood pressure and heart rate and increase muscle tension. And that's where we get the backaches and all the physical reactions. Journaling also helps short circuit the chronic stress following traumatic events. So, reconnecting and becoming more comfortable with suppressed memories calms the fear center of the brain, which is the one that is overreactive during grief. Um, yes. All right. All right. So, how you can support someone who is grieving. These are some things that can be helpful. So, being a good listener, respecting the person's way of grieving, being understanding of mood swings. I'm very sorry, unexpected visitor. Respecting the person's way of grieving, being understanding of mood swings, avoid giving advice. I know sometimes it can be a point of leaning in and maybe saying the right thing to that person that's grieving, but I think it's really a matter of just being there for them, refrain from trying to explain the loss, help out with practical tasks, stay connected and available, and offer words that touch the heart. So overall, what I'm seeing here is, being present for that person, trying to help as much as you can, and just letting them know that, you are there for them, being a social support. Did you want to add something to that, Cassandra?
Oh, I can always add something. Thanks for asking. I just think it's a good point in terms of avoid giving advice.
Mhm,
Again, because essentially what we're saying, what we've been repeating throughout the presentation is that grief is unique to everyone, right?
mhm,
So giving unwarranted advice isn't the best, the best approach to do. Of course, if someone's asking you for it, offer that advice, but truly, grief is unique. Grieving is unique for everyone. So it's not going to look the same. It's not going to look the same. So I do like that point too.
all right. Thank you. And that brings me to the end of the webinar. And I just put in a quick quote here. If we don't work through the traumatic experiences that we have, they will continue to be an obstacle in our lives. So really, being able to work through it, if you haven't started, you know, um, it's important that you look into that and maybe even ask why haven't I started, you know.
Thank you, Nancy. This was a very great, informative presentation. And thank you for those that have interacted in the chat. It more so was questions about this video. So this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. Um, in less than a week. So please do check our website to be able to rewatch, relearn, or even maintain what you've already learned today. If you would like to meet with Nancy as well, please contact One Piece Therapy. She is accepting new clients and offers free consultations if you would like to just chat more about grief. Um, and thank you for joining us today. Or in general, if you would like to seek a therapist, please, please do get that support for yourself because grieving is natural and it deserves space to process a natural experience. Um, Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Cassandra.